Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Anglo Election Insights. And, well, the new developments just keep on coming. We had a poll from Demos Au that dropped just yesterday. I'm recording this on Sunday. And the One Nation bomb has apparently gone off in Victoria. Now, I know not all of you are big fans of Demos Au, but they do have a perfectly good track record in terms of state elections so far. Had a bit of a miss federally, especially with their final poll. But most of the industry did. And when that poll at the start of the year came out, which showed One Nation tied with the Liberals, they were the first to find that in their fieldwork. And then ultimately, every pollster has gone on to find a similar or a more exaggerated trend with One Nation surpassing the coalition vote. So I wouldn't throw this out just yet, but at the same time, I won't be releasing any sort of more official forecasts in terms of seats or anything until I've seen the next batch of Resolve and Redbridge polling at the very least. And I assume both are in the field and will have results for us in the coming weeks. We might even get a news poll or that. Who knows, maybe even Fox and Hedgehog will pop up and deliver us something from Victoria. But for now, here are the headline numbers if you haven't seen them. Labor all the way back to 23%. The coalition have dropped back to 29%, which is a poor result for them, really. I mean, it's a long time since I've seen a poll with them back in the 20s in Victoria. The Greens, Demos Au has had the Greens kind of sitting in and around the mid-teens for a while now, higher, at least 2 points higher than most of the other pollsters in Victoria. But of course, the big news is One Nation debuting at 21% in a Victorian lower house poll. As we can see, the change in vote, the Greens doing well. One Nation obviously out of nowhere. Labor taking on most of the losses. Others also taking on losses. That's probably right-wing minor party voters drifting to One Nation, and then the coalition taking on some losses as well. But only about a quarter of One Nation's vote coming from 2022 coalition voters, apparently, which would be encouraging for them, and it has resulted in better preference flows, and the headline two-party preferred figure statewide has the coalition 3% ahead, which is their best result for, I couldn't tell you how long, but it is a good result for them. So I want to talk a little bit about a theory I've seen going around, and it's not without its basis, but there are definitely some people who have been pointing to the fact that Labor could lose the statewide two-party preferred but still retain government. We have historical evidence or precedents that that's certainly possible, and the big point in their favour is that the post-election pendulum from 2022 shows that in terms, if there was a uniform swing across all seats, the minimum uniform swing required for the coalition to win enough seats to form government is 8%. But of course, we know that anything over 5% will see them actually win the statewide two-party preferred. Now, some historical evidence there includes the 2010 and 2014 elections in South Australia, and also the 1998 federal election. But there's probably other examples too. You guys can let me know in the comments. However, the upper house is going to be very difficult for Labor if that's the case, and this polling just kind of underscores that. You could see the potential here for both the coalition and One Nation to have more upper house seats than Labor, although the system isn't truly proportional and there are some bigger numbers for some of the left-leaning minor parties, which probably means Labor would have more seats than One Nation at least. But you get the idea. I think off these numbers, you'd have something in the region of 18, 19, 20 seats just between the coalition and One Nation. So I guess Labor and the progressive parties would be walking a very tight balance trying to pass legislation through the upper house, even if they did hold government. And the other thing is that I believe that there are some pockets within Victoria that are a little bit electorally distorted after 2022. and I think there's going to be some reversion back to mean in terms of the swings and the political shifts. So we'll talk a little bit about that here. Now, in 2014, this is the 2014 South Australian post-election pendulum. So this is the one where Labor loses the statewide two-party preferred by 3%, but retains government by, I think it was like one seat, and maybe some independents were helping. However, I think Adelaide or South Australia's demography and geography plays a bit of a role here, and I'm not totally sure that a similar result could be, or maybe not possible, but I don't think it's as easy to replicate in a place like Victoria. So you can see here that on the Liberal side of the aisle, they have some serious vote sinks out in the kind of pastoral rural areas. You see Flinders, MacKillop, Chaffey, Stewart, margins well above 20%. And then, whereas on the Labor side, yeah, there are some fairly safe seats in Adelaide's northern suburbs, but what Adelaide doesn't have is this like really progressive central hub where you've got two-party preferred margins into the 20s and 30s like you do in other cities in Australia, including Melbourne. So I think this is so effectively what you have is this kind of fairly moderate area throughout metropolitan Adelaide, a lot of swing seats or a lot of seats where Labor's margin is comfortable without being blowout, and then you have a lot of seats in the country and on Adelaide's periphery, at least back then, where the Liberals had a really strong vote. And that kind of skews the statewide two-party preferred in a way that I think might be a little bit particular to South Australia. So to demonstrate that, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of these seats in inner Melbourne where there are massive two-party preferred blowout margins. So this is between Labor and the Coalition. Obviously, a seat like Brunswick, Footscray, Melbourne, those are actually Labor versus Greens contests, but the notional two-party preferred margins are listed here. And you can see there are some massive margins. Brunswick, Northcote, Richmond in particular, Melbourne as well, up into the high 20s and even the early 30s. Now, the Coalition has some big ones, like I think Shepparton is about 25%, Murray Plains is kind of something similar, but they don't have, they don't have a seat like Northcote or Brunswick. They don't have like an 85-15 seat. So I do think that you've got kind of some heavy vote sinks for both Labor and the Coalition at either end of the spectrum, and that sort of helps even things out in a way that you don't really have in South Australia. So I'm not sort of subscribed to the idea that Labor could lose the statewide two-party preferred by 3%, but still hold government. Like, I think that would require an even bigger distortion than what happened in South Australia in 2014. The other thing I wanted to point out was that I guess the COVID politics and perhaps Victoria having a seemingly a very strong urban-rural divide, particularly depending on where you are rurally. I think particularly across Melbourne's north and western suburbs, you had particularly large swings towards the Coalition on two-party preferred that perhaps I think a lot of us are saying that those are going to moderate a little bit. So if we do see a statewide swing of about 6 or 7% towards the Coalition statewide, I think it's going to be a lot cooler as a swing. And in fact, seats like Greenvale, Mill Park, St Albans, they might even go back the other way against the statewide swing. I think there's just it's not reflective of the true reality anymore now that we're out of COVID times. And to some extent, I think that's also true in Melbourne's East and in some of these provincial seats, particularly like South Barwon and Geelong, where you had the opposite effect, where COVID politics actually benefited Labor significantly. So I've gone over that in previous videos, but I just wanted to reiterate that I have my reservations when we've got this idea of Labor losing the statewide two-party preferred, but retaining government, particularly if we're talking about, like 52, 53, 54% two-party preferred. They could do it narrowly, but maybe not to the extent that South Australian Labor did it in 2014. So then I wanted to go a little bit further into the demographics of this Demos Au poll. So here we've got results by education, One Nation doing particularly well with like year 12 or below. The coalition ahead with TAFE accredited. But then the key one here for me is university degree holders. The coalition have a strong lead here, and their vote's not getting eaten into too much by One Nation. Obviously, with the high Green vote, that would make the two-party preferred breakdown probably almost even, I think, on those numbers. But there are more university degree holders, I think, well, certainly in kind of inner Melbourne, but also probably more on the eastern side where you have a higher concentration of professionals and managers and those sort of white-collar type workers. And that's the more kind of politically volatile part of Melbourne, which the coalition really needs to win back. And to see their vote holding up there, Labor's collapsing and One Nation's not really kind of having too much impact, that would be very encouraging for the Liberals. Same again with housing tenure. One Nation doing particularly well with renters, which is interesting. The mortgage numbers look remarkably similar to the headline numbers as well. And that, I think if the coalition were to win the two-party preferred in amongst like mortgage holders, that would put them in a very, very good position to win the election. And then we've owned the Liberals still maintaining a pretty good vote with outright home owners. We'll continue on. So then we've got results by income. Again, I think the coalition would be happy to see One Nation not making as many inroads in terms of these higher income earners, which you're going to see those are a little bit more concentrated within suburban Melbourne and even provincial Victoria, and not so much out in the sticks, which is where One Nation appears to be making their biggest gains if we look at the location results. You can see here rural and regional, which is a bundle of both like rural communities and provincial cities from what I can tell, which is why I think the Labor and Liberal votes are fairly close there. One Nation obviously doing particularly well, showing that perhaps in Victoria their vote is particularly concentrated in the rural areas. But out of Metro, the Liberals have a pretty strong lead, and One Nation feeding them quite a lot of preferences. So the left-right split of the vote is quite good for the right, whereas in inner Metro, obviously the left-right split is in favour of the left, but such is Melbourne's kind of political geography that certain inner Metro seats are relatively safe for the Liberal Party, whereas others are, as we saw before, are incredibly safe for the left or the progressive parties. All right, so that's all for the slides, but I thought wouldn't be a video without a cheeky map. So we're going to just take us out of the slides and going to jump across to a little map that I popped together last night. Now, this isn't like an official forecast or anything like that. So if you see something that raises your eyebrows, ask me a question in the comments, but I haven't made like full decisions here. I just wanted to kind of go into what the impact of One Nation's rise in the polls could be and the collapse in vote share for the combined major parties as well. So across most of rural Victoria, I do think that what you're going to end up with is the Nats losing 10 to 15% of the vote and One Nation overtaking Labor and entering the two-candidate preferred. But I think Labor preferences will allow the Nationals to continue to win most of these seats. However, there are a couple of exceptions. One of those is my home seat of Ripon, where I know that the Liberal Party and the National Party both want to run candidates, and you've obviously got the sitting Labor member. But unlike these more like southern parts of rural Victoria, these more kind of like dairy farming districts where One Nation didn't perform very well at the federal election. Ripon kind of straddles three different federal seats, Ballarat, Wannon and Mallee, and in all three of those seats where the booths overlap, there was some strong performances from One Nation, and that crosses three different candidates in different campaigns. So that kind of gives me the idea that it's an overall party brand that seems to be performing well in this area. The difficulty that One Nation would have is the increasing levels of diversity that we're seeing on the periphery of Ballarat, particularly at Lucas, which is a growth corridor to Ballarat's west. But I do think with a split coalition vote and the history of the way this seat votes with the shooters, fishers and farmers polling quite well back in 2022, I do think there's a lot of conservative non-major party vote out there, and obviously farmers are starting to sour a little bit on the Nats, and I do think they could form a critical mass on these polls numbers and potentially win this seat in a matchup with Labor. Over in Bendigo East, I think the Nats candidate there, or the potential Nats candidate, Andrew Lethlean, must be looking at some of these polls and thinking, damn, I really have a chance. And I think based on that, I've given it away. Once again, Jacinta Allen's ratings are in the toilet. I do still think there's a possibility she gets rolled and that one goes to either by-election or the seat's empty going into the election as well. I have a few other Liberal flips, seats like South Barwon, Bellarine, Macedon, Point Cook, Eureka. I won't go into too much depth as to my rationale there, but if you've got questions, do leave them in the comments and I'll do my best. Bass is another one where One Nation could potentially get ahead of a split coalition ticket, but I think the voting history of the seat is probably such that the Liberals have a strong enough lead over the Nationals that One Nation wouldn't be able to knock both coalition parties out of the count. But where I think there could be danger of that is in both Morwell and Narracam, particularly in Morwell, where there is this kind of strong ancestral Labor vote, particularly in towns like Churchill, Moe, these ex-mining, ex-coal towns, I guess, and still to some extent current coal towns in the Latrobe Valley, where I think, there is definitely potential for One Nation to get ahead of the Nationals and boot them out of the final pairing and win easily against Labor. These are some booths where One Nation in the federal election were polling, like some of these polling places there up in the high teens or almost into the early 20s. So I could imagine in some, like that could translate to like mid to high 30% primary vote for One Nation, thinking back to the fact that in the Demos poll, they were polling at 30% in rural Victoria. And it's a similar thing in Narracam. It's a little bit more suburban, particularly in the Warragul Druin area, but strong One Nation booths throughout in the overlapping federal election. And I think there's enough of a Labor vote that an exchange of Liberal and One Nation votes could be such that whoever kind of wins that contest is the one that goes on to beat Labor, rather than having them face off against each other, as I'm predicting in places like East and South Gippsland, Ovens Valley, Euroa, all these other seats. And then, I won't go into too much detail with Melbourne itself, but a few things I wanted to point out. I think Labor probably doing just enough to hold on to some of their outer suburban holdings, particularly seats like Cranbourne, Frankston, the Narre Warrens as well, becoming quite diverse, and fairly significant Islamic populations as well. And we saw federally that was quite decisive in the seats of Bruce and Holt as well, with the Southeast, or the South Asian communities too, in Holt in particular. Mordialloc and Carrum, I think back on 2010 boundaries, they would potentially be pickups for the Liberal Party, but now with Mordialloc taking in areas of Keysborough and that sort of thing, that's probably made it very difficult for the Liberals to pick that up. But I've got a couple of hot takes in here that I just want to run by you guys. I've got the seat of Clorinda going Liberal, as well as Bentley, and that's partly based on what's going on there between the state Labor government and the local government minister, Nick Stakos, with the city of Kingston, in terms of, like, there might have been a bit of pressure to push through a grant for some local religious organisation that one of the local Labor aligned councillors was behind. There just seems to be all sorts of problems with this council and the state government, and if anything, I think it's not reflecting all that well on the Labor government, who Labor used to control this council for a long time, but then they lost control of it, and that seems to have caused a lot of issues. There is also the potential for some of those sitting independent councillors, who a couple of them actually ran as independents last state election, and they polled like high single figures. So Caroline White in Clarinda, and I think it's Sarah O'Donnell in Mordialloc. They might decide to run again, and they could actually do some serious damage and potentially make the two candidate preferred. And also, I think there's a big issue, long-running issue in the Dingley Village area. There's a new development planned for the golf course, which is on a floodplain, that local residents and the local council are opposed to. But there was apparently some sneaky thing where the council missed a deadline, and now it's going ahead. So there's all kinds of little local issues going on there. I don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but on these numbers, I thought, let's flip it to the Liberals to draw some attention to it, and keep an eye on how things progress there. And then also the other big story of that poll, which no one's really talking about, was the Greens, who I think could potentially pick up a lot of these seats in inner Melbourne if they are indeed making such gains with young people, young renters, and Labor's vote is going so far backwards. One to watch is Paran, where if Labor's vote does begin to recover a little bit, Labor are going to be running a pretty strong candidate there, and that could be, if that sort of realignment from Green to Labor continues on this side of the Yarra, that could be one to watch, because Labor would definitely win the seat if they manage to enter the two candidate preferred. And then I've got the West Party winning in Werribee and St Albans. The only reason I've got that at this stage is because they've announced their candidates early. I think they're going to run really hard in those particular seats. And I also don't think the major parties, or any party really, are going to be able to clear 25-30%. There's going to be preferences flying around everywhere. And I think solid, locally well-known candidates are probably in the best position to soak up some of those preferences. And, I don't expect Labor and the Liberals to have particularly big budgets to be able to defend these seats or attack these seats. So they strike me as areas where, the West Party could really capitalise on the potential lack of political interest there, and preference flows coming from multiple different parties, and low primary vote totals for the major parties. Other than that, I think that's all I really wanted to say. But obviously, this map's looking pretty bad for Labor, but that's mostly because that poll looked pretty bad for Labor. We will wait and see if that bears out in other polls. But for the moment, based on that Demos Au poll, I have the coalition winning a narrow majority with a pretty sizable crossbench, and Labor taking on heavy losses. Please let me know what you think, respectfully, of course. And keep an eye out for future updates on Victorian state politics as we get a little bit more information. We've obviously had the CFMEU corruption allegations as well, which this poll didn't capture, and that might even cause even more damage to Labor. We don't even know that yet. So keep our eyes peeled, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.